Hey everyone, we're talking about Pluto in Gemini and Pluto in the third house today. No one alive has Pluto in Gemini, but we're still reading the words of many of these individuals. This was a generation of amazing writers. But plenty of Pluto in the third house people are in the world right now, including people in this meeting today. And I invite you to interrupt me during this presentation to ask questions or make comments. And with that, I'll just start. I want to start a little bit with the Pluto and Gemini generation. A lot of them had the Pluto-Neptune conjunction as well. So there was a really mystical, interesting quality to this generation. But if you look back on like literary history, there's a lot of greats in this generation, which shouldn't be too surprising when we place, the soul in the sign of Gemini. So just to back up a little bit, Pluto is going to represent the soul in a natal chart, and the sign and house it's in will tell us a story about what vibrations this person has been going through and working on and learning about from life to life to life. What are they attached to? Where are their talents? Where are their strengths? Where is their power? So Pluto and Gemini, we have people like Anais Nin. She's my favorite writer, so I say her first. Henry Miller, Ayn Rand, Samuel Beckett, Vladimir Nabokov, J.R. Tolkien, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, Langston Hughes, William Carlos Williams. There's a huge list. John Steinbeck, William Faulkner, Zora Neale Hurston, Anna Akhmatova, D.H. Lawrence, and plenty more, but I'm going to talk about a few of them just real quick to get a little bit of an energy for Pluto and Gemini, and we'll move to Pluto in the third house. So Pluto and Gemini, I'll talk about, there's this logic quality to Gemini. And since we're going to also look at the polarity point of ninth house and Sagittarius, you can see souls that care so much about language or about rhetoric itself. Maybe it doesn't matter what the philosophy is, or the philosophy comes second. Anais Nin has a great example of the two-faced quality that we associate with Gemini. At one point, actually having two separate families, where she had lies that she would tell to each family, like she would, be going on vacation, but really going to be spend time with her other family. So I picked up a quote about this from Wikipedia. It says, Nin referred to her simultaneous marriages as her bi-coastal trapeze. I really associate acrobatics in general with Gemini and the mutables. So according to a friend, Anais would set up these elaborate facades in Los Angeles and New York, but it became so complicated that she had to create something she called the lie box. She had this absolutely enormous purse, and in the purse she had two sets of checkbooks. One said Anais Goyler, I don't know how to pronounce it, for New York, and another said Anais Pohl for Los Angeles. She had prescription bottles from California doctors and New York doctors with two different names, and she had a collection of file cards. And she said, I tell so many lies, I have to write them down and keep them in the lie box so I can keep them straight. Anais Nin also, if anyone here is familiar with her work, she published her diaries. There's something really seductive and sexy, Plutonic about her writing. There's like this, juiciness that comes through with her words. She also is a Pisces and has like a lot of other mutable qualities, but there was a sense that there was like this desire to experience many different things. Gemini loves multiplicity. And the Sagittarius ninth house of like having, one direction or one belief, not so much. See, Nabokov, he is very famous for Lolita, which is a controversial novel. It's told from the perspective of an older man who's attracted to someone who's about, I think 14 or 15. So that was a very, it's a classic work of literature, really beautiful, also very dark and very taboo. You have Ernest Hemingway. He, many of these writers we can they made something innovative or, really brought their soul, Pluto, into their writing, where they've created and brought something new into it. With Ernest Hemingway, if I'm remembering correctly from high school, he had these, these punchy kind of like punch you, like Pluto lines of dialogue, and just like really like, all of these writers, there's this concept where they like really brought you into it, something very evocative about all of them. So I'll move on from the Pluto and Gemini people now and just talk about Pluto in third house, in the third house in general. Very mentally and intellectually charged. The third house is ruled by Mercury and Gemini. So when we place the soul within the intellect, there's a great attachment to ideas. And Gemini typically, we hear about it like being a little bit all over the place, like there's an interest in one thing and an interest in another thing, and then something else over here, and there's this kind of distractible quality to Gemini. But Pluto is so focused and it goes so deep. So when you put Pluto in the third house, it's kind of like a person who can go down all these different rabbit holes. And they may get attached to a certain rabbit hole. That can be being attached to a certain kind of way of thinking. Thinking that, maybe if I do some inner discovery or talk to a therapist or something, I'll lose my sense of humor. And they're really attached to humor as a way of thinking. Or it can be science, like really attached to science, have a job working in a lab or working with a pharmaceutical company, and streams of information that would challenge or threaten that are extra challenging to Pluto third house. And then there's this concept with Pluto in the third house. By the way, if there's any thoughts or questions, feel free. When I talk about Gemini, I feel like I go all over the place. I just like become the archetype a little bit. So excuse me for that. But Gemini third house, when you put Pluto there, there's going to be an emphasis on cleverness within the character of these people. Because cleverness has been something that's been worked on a soul level. And how I define cleverness, we can start with being able to get in and out of a situation really quickly, like agile. Pluto is going to represent, our laser-like free will when it's uninhibited, when it's gone through some kind of purification process or is in a state of empowerment. People can just kind of like cleverly zip into a situation and cleverly get out. A friend from childhood comes to mind who we were always doing like silly stuff and getting in trouble. And whenever we got caught, she would just say something that, just came out. I don't even know how she generated it. And then the person who caught us would be like, oh, like carry on and like walk away. And so she just had this way of really easily getting out of trouble. And the cleverness piece in general, when you look at Pluto, you can see that people have a lot of strength and power in a certain area. And that can be used to like kind of fertilize the rest of life and like provide empowerment to multiple areas, or it can be a way of like using that strength to not develop other things. So one thing that can happen with Pluto in the third house is having this kind of underlying cleverness that, other situations, like if we're going to look at ninth house Sagittarius as the opposite point, there's this authenticity piece. So it could be about like, being more clever than moral at a certain point, until the desire nature becomes about kind of catching up other pieces of consciousness with that. So we can get more into that later if there's more we want to just explore there. The other piece I want to bring up is siblings. The third house typically represents siblings. So people with Pluto in the third house may have power struggles, Pluto with siblings, or very intense, emotionally charged connections with siblings. It could be this kind of investment in how the other sibling lives their life, like wanting to, get a sibling on track with, their ideology or vice versa. A Pluto in the third house person really wanting to help their siblings or correct their siblings in some way. So there could be very strong soul contracts with siblings, with people that have this placement. In general, this also correlates with how Gemini in the third house has to do with this very local quality, versus Sagittarius ninth house is very big picture. So a person with Pluto in the third house can get very into, just like one of these rabbit holes I was talking about, of like something like a hobby and going really deep into that and being really, really focused on this, fairly local part of life. And so the polarity point comes in the terms of like, what do I want to do with my life? Or what's the big picture? What does it all mean? Because Pluto in the third house can see so many different perspectives, so many different facets of an issue, there hasn't really been maybe a desire to commit to one particular truth in the same way you would see with Sagittarius or ninth house. This can eventually create some kind of paralysis of like, well, if anything's true, why bother picking a truth? And that can be the kind of like distracted, I have all these interests, but I don't know how to collect them or focus on one thing enough to see it through. There's a quality of absurdism that we get with the third house as well. I'm just kind of like, well, if, none of these things are true, like, it's just a carnival and I can do whatever I want. And there's like maybe a why believe in anything quality. So not everyone with Pluto in the third house is going to be there. People with Pluto in the third house can have, beliefs and direction. Not saying that. That just is more of the kind of like Sagittarius archer, like arrow pointing a direction in one way. While at the same time, Sagittarius does have that kind of all over the place quality in the same way as Gemini. There's a general kind of vision that it's all feeding into. So if a Gemini influence person or Pluto in the third house person is feeling really lost, not sure where to go, sometimes even just, really focusing on what is the big picture here? What is the umbrella that all of these other little experiences fit into? Another thing that can be helpful for Pluto in the third house people is the concept of kind of like a breadcrumb trail. Benigno Mazzaro, who's a like modern philosopher that I really like, called it the breadcrumb trail of excitement, which is a really cute phrase. But it's like this idea that you would pay attention and prioritize the things that really light you up and really excite you, because it's one choice that has a domino effect of all these other choices. And so if a person is constantly picking like a bland, like, well, I guess I have to do this thing, and they just do that, versus this thing that's electrifying them and really exciting and has that kind of passion, magnetism, attraction quality of Pluto, the domino effects from these kind of bland, like, choices are not that exciting. And so a person with Pluto in the third house, they can be very opportunistic, have, these ideas of like, oh, this is where I should be putting my energy. And they put their energy there, and the domino effect has them on their path. So while they might have this very local focus where they're, focused on the task at hand or the thing that is grabbing their attention, the focus will keep repeating itself from thing to thing to thing that they keep jumping on. So that in and of itself is a lot of momentum. And the polarity point of Sagittarius and ninth house can be used in terms of general philosophy, core values. If there's a belief of, or a philosophy of where one is wanting to take their life, and they're really loyal to that, these little local experiences that pop up and lead to one thing to the next can be under that umbrella. Pluto in the third house people, very good communicators. language is something that they've really developed in many lifetimes. It can also be, there's a certain intensity of the soul that many of us know. So in childhood, it wouldn't be that uncommon for people with Pluto in the third house to have some kind of speech difficulty or feel like communication is really a struggle. Generally, Pluto is going to speak to our strengths, and it also speaks to kind of these adverse early circumstances, like where we experience our disempowerment too, and that whole arc of transformation. So you can see someone having really good communication skills. You can also see people working through, manipulation with words and how words can be used to influence others. There's propaganda. Even the Pluto and Gemini generation, or that time period when Pluto was in Gemini, like we saw like World War propaganda. My history stuff is going out the window, but some kind of political propaganda at that time. And so being able to manipulate with words. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. Okay. Manipulating with words. Anyway, that can just be, these people can have like a very sharp tongue, even without trying. That might be something that they learn how to use. Kind of like a baby rattlesnake doesn't really know how to administer some poison, it just administers all of it. If there's a level of toxicity or like angst within a person with this placement, it can like kind of just come out in their speech. Another way that could play out is about the nervous system and having like weird muscle pain or just like weird ailments. And that can be a result of just needing to kind of clear out the nervous system through some kind of practice. It can be meditation, yoga. It's just about clearing out that charged energy. And since Pluto's the soul and third house is going to be nervous system, it could be like having soul contents and stuck like Scorpio toxin kind of stuff in the nervous system itself. The tricky aspect of that is that the mind is something that we know to be very powerful, and we also know that it's something that we can't really control. We think things involuntarily, and sometimes we also believe our thoughts, even though our thoughts happen with a will of their own. So if you're getting all these kind of like aches and pains, they can become like a reality of themselves, or even just like toxic thoughts become a reality in of themselves. Third house Pluto people can really benefit from the kind of teachings about how to use your thoughts for positivity and how to not believe your thoughts, stuff like that, because there's such mental charge and soul like depth within the mental faculties and nervous system of these individuals, that can be something that they really struggle with, or something that really empowers them. Either way. I'll stop there for a second. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts?
I do. So I'm looking at my son's chart because I recognized him in what you were saying, and I started. So of course he has Pluto in the third. In fact, he has 11 Leo as his ascendant as well, but he has a sun in Pisces, so it's quite a bit of a different dynamic than what you have there. But oh my gosh, you're reading his life right now. Sharp tongue.
Yeah. Another thing that reminds me of is that Pluto in the third house people, Pluto, I feel like represents how psychic we are. It's catching the undercurrents. And I think that most people, are psychic to some extent, though we're patriarchally, culturally conditioned to not listen to that and think that, things have to be visible and seen to be real and all of that. But Pluto in the third house people are, you know, just like Gemini, really good at finishing your sentence, but it goes deeper in this Pluto level where it's like they hear your thoughts. I've been around Pluto in the third house people where they really just say out loud the very thing I was thinking. It's really cool. It's like they hear the chatter in the airwaves. Let's see. I think one thing I remember reading from the Pluto book by Jeffrey Wolf Green was that there's the use of, you know, in conversation, other people's words as like a launching point, where there's this like kind of like, you know, it's a chatty energy, but then you bring in the Pluto like energy. I don't even know how to describe it, but I have noticed that too. So yeah, if we're good on some of that stuff for now, I'll talk a little bit more about the ninth house and Sagittarius as the polarity point and balance. And I think actually I did want to mention a little bit more about the kind of duplicity or lying piece, which is kind of like, that's like the bad rap that Gemini gets, is like the lying or the two-facedness. And Pluto is itself about trust, and as an archetype involves deceit. So just like psychologically, some of the situations that could arise that motivate, which is Pluto motivation, a person to lie. You know, one can be that while Gemini is about bridging things and it can really bridge gaps between different streams of data, there can be a certain Pluto security in being like one of those facets. Not every person is just like one person all the time. We actually do code switch all the time. Like, you know, you're a different person at work than you are at home. You're a different person with one friend, you're a different person with your mom. And a person with Pluto in the third might have extra sensitivity to how they're all these different people in these different situations. And that might be like a source of, you know, how do you integrate that? There can be some confusion around that, especially for young people with this placement, where they don't really know how to bridge those things. And that can be a great source of like really bringing people together. One of Gemini and Pluto in the third house gifts is making connections, bridging people, bridging communities, this kind of like, oh, there's someone I think you should talk to, and you do, and it's great. And it was a good, you know, connection made by your Pluto in the third house friend. So the quality of like, you know, how can I be all these different people? Will I be loved? Will I be accepted? Will I get my emotional security needs met if I'm one person now and another person then? And like, you know, how do I navigate that within my personal relationships? There's also the kind of like, because, you know, Gemini itself and third house is very kind of like effervescent and bubbly and, you know, like chatty and all these different things. But when you add Pluto there, it kind of slows it down. And so it's the same thing, but it's happening like at the speed of like, you know, a snake molting its scales and like, you know, this like longer time period. So you have like one form of a being and it seems really real and really rooted and really grounded. It's like Scorpio solid. And then all of a sudden it shifts. And so there's like it's kind of like the shiftiness of Gemini, but add an exoskeleton or something when you add the Scorpio Pluto archetype. So this could be really powerful. Like if you think about like, if you've seen acrobats or performers who are really agile on stage, and like their agility and like the power of their movements can give you the chills. It's like so deeply powerful. I think that, you know, there could be a person, for example, who's really in love with like two different people and is two different people with these two different people. And that's going to create some kind of insecurity of like, how can I, who do I choose, or who do I choose to be in this case if I can access these different personalities? The polarity point, we bring in Sagittarius and ninth house. There's a lot about speaking the truth. And Gemini has a bunch of different truths, a bunch of different way of seeing things. I'm not trying to make it sound like Gemini lies, because that's the bad rap thing, and I'm like wanting to defend that somehow too, because I don't think that that's exclusively Gemini. So if anyone can bail me out of that one, let me know.
I can. It's a very creative mental focus. I only say this because I recognize this in my oldest. He will create a scenario, and that's how he buys into it. I mean, it's not, it's not lying. It's, I believe this, and he creates it, and his mind is so quick. I mean, he's brilliant. He's really a smart kid. He's 33. He's not a kid. He pulls in all these facts and figures and everything from everywhere, and there it is. There's the facts, and you better buy into it too, or else there might be an argument.
Yeah, there's really a great integration quality with Pluto in the third house. There's like a mimicry aspect too, which is like the power of mimicry, like being able to like, you could see actors who can do a bunch of different voices with this, improv actors, like people who can be really quick-witted. But then the integration.
Too.
What?
Amazing singers too. I bet Tova can sing.
Oh, okay. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, and I feel Pluto reminds me a little bit of metabolism. I'm not sure if that's, there's a recycling quality with Pluto. But with Gemini and third house, you're picking up so much information. So people with Pluto in the third can really synthesize and create these like interdisciplinary meditations. They can, very widely focus. They're a bit, Scorpio and Gemini form an inconjunct. So they're slightly contradictory archetypes in that Scorpio wants to go deep, Pluto wants to go deep, and Gemini is more like horizontal and connecting dots between things. So it does create a very animated and depth landscape, especially if a person will allow themselves to explore their interests and not feel bad about it. If we look at the way that public school has made Gemini a pathology or like some kind of illness, or like you need medication for your attention deficit disorder, there's just all this cultural conditioning about like, you have to be focused on one thing. Like you have to be an efficient factory worker. You can't be distracted. And even people think that in terms of like being successful. They're like, I have to have a vision. And there's a lot of people that kind of stumble into their vision by trying a lot of different things. Oh, here's a chat. Says lying from the idea of what?
I didn't know I didn't want to cut you off earlier, but it was about the lying thing, where it goes back to what you were saying about the kind of hearing other people's thoughts, that it's more that once I recognized that that's what I was tuning into, it's not that I was I can necessarily lie. It's more, I know what that person needs to hear to feel comfortable. So it's being able to use the exact words to sort of help that situation. So it's like, I wouldn't even call it lying, but it's like choosing words very carefully, but it's because I know what they're feeling and thinking.
Yeah.
I know that was
cool. That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that. So it's using words and language for emotional security, which is what Pluto represents.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
choosing the right words to manipulate. So manipulation is Pluto, and choosing the right words is Gemini.
I've been in arguments with Pluto in the third house people before where I realized that I just actually couldn't win. Like, it didn't matter if my ideas were right.
You better have your facts straight.
What?
But that too can also be the Sag, bouncing over to the Sag polarity, because, you know, there's that saying, you can never argue with a Sag.
Yeah.
Like, you can never win. Like, there's just no way. It's almost, sometimes I think Sag is almost like its own fixed sign. It's weird, because they just kind of take in the information. But I think it just bounces off that polarity, Gemini Sag, you know?
Yeah.
Wanda, I think you were going to say something. Wanda?
Yeah, I think too with this placement, they can pick up on what's not spoken. You know, like what might be said, but they can pick up on the actual meaning of what's said. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The subtext.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also Pluto in the third house people are very sensitive to like the symbolism of just a landscape. So it would be like, you know, you're having dinner with someone that you're in a relationship with, and the relationship has been like going sour for a bit. And this is like a night to kind of like, you know, okay, we're gonna like do this. But then this song comes on the radio all about breaking up, and there's just this like awareness between the two people of like, you know, we hear those words and it's like really dissonant, or, you know, and like that kind of thing. It's like feeling the when signals from the environment really resonate, or when they are really repelling, and sometimes when they're both at the same time. And so just that, like, you know, it's like dream symbols within reality, which kind of also brings in the Sagittarius quality too, where, you know, that's the meaning, that's like the shamanic meaning, but Gemini and third house stuff, like that's the signifier. And so these people who have this signature can be really, they pick up on those cues. And it's like the subtext really of a conversation, subtext of a landscape. And if Pluto, when we talk about that, you know, our inner reality is mirrored externally, this can be one way that it shows up. It looked like someone was about to unmute themselves and talk, but no? Okay. But this, you know, Gemini, I think it's one of the most, and Sag too, they're very fun. They're both very opportunistic. You know, when they see, a Gemini has a lot to do with chaos, and not just chaos in this like, you know, oh, there's no, you know, no order, everything's like askew, but chaos is in this kind of like fertile birthplace of new order coming from like an emerging pattern. And so if a new situation arises, and there's like a mutation in the environment, you know, some new offer, some new opportunity, Gemini, third house Pluto, Sagittarius people, they hop on that quicker than any other signs, it seems. And so they really can have this adventurous, flexible, mutable, exciting path. And then if we're, you know, thinking about Pluto, this is also going to be the exact opposite, the like fear of that, the fear of change, the fear of mutation, which would be the, you know, being attached to one specific thought structure. And even, you know, there's the attraction towards Sagittarius exploration, belief, cosmology, philosophy, or the total like being repelled by it of like, you know, we're like on this rock hurling in space. Don't tell me that it means anything. That's weird and it scares me. There's like that vibration with it too at times. So I want to open it again for questions or thoughts, and then we can look at an example. Oh, and there's a chat thing here.
I just think it's funny, right before you came through, Dawn and Alice and we were discussing like bugs kind of making themselves appear in your external reality. And I was like, yeah, lately I've been like realizing that they come with messages, and I'll go look up the qualities of that thing. And it's like, oh, that's why the spider was like climbing down my bed. And it's like putting meaning to it. So I thought that was funny when you like brought that through. We were just talking about it.
Animal totems, I think of, it's on the Sagittarius Gemini axis, definitely. But they're, symbols, and symbolism is Gemini, third house. So it's interesting, even just like as a culture, that it is still kind of unusual to think that an insect randomly appearing in your room that's like an unusual insect to see inside like a praying mantis, or even like a spider, because spiders know like where people are. They appear, like, I think at least, they know what they're doing when they appear. And so the thought of like, oh no, like the rest of the world that's not human has no like meaning, it doesn't choose when to show up, like that itself, I don't know, it's like yeah, that's another thing. But that's like, that brings us into Sagittarius too, is like, do we want to believe anything about reality, or do we want to think that it's all random and just kind of like, oh, explain it away, which is one thing that we could do in that scenario. I think if there's not any other questions, we should look at Tova's chart.
I have a comment, Sabrina.
Yeah.
My dad had Pluto in Gemini. He also had Mercury in Scorpio. And all of the stuff that you're saying is kind of helping me to understand why I never really thought I knew him. I mean, like the subtext, he knew what we were talking about, the lying, but not really lying. I remember finding a card, snooping in his wallet and finding a card that he belonged to the Liars Club, and the sharp tongue, and how clever he was, and how cute.
Thank you for sharing that. That reminded me of something, but I forgot.
I have a friend who has Pluto in the third house, and it's so interesting how whenever we go out, she can tune into everybody's conversations. She can pick up a little bit here, a little bit there, and she'll tell you the whole story. I can't do that. I can only focus on one thing at a time, and it's amazing to see her pick up all these stories from the tables around us. Yeah.
I mean, Gemini, third house, it's like picking up information from like, this like radial directions. I have a memory of being with a third house Pluto person, and I was like emotional about something. I was like crying over dinner, and there was another person like or like group celebrating a birthday, and they were getting louder and louder singing, and the person was just like started bursting out laughing. They're like, I'm sorry, but this is just so weird, like, and like noting that like he just couldn't focus on the conversation that was happening because there was this like birthday party, and it was just like absurd. And like that's, and then I was like, oh, it is kind of absurd, and it kind of like loosened up my attachment to feeling as upset as I was feeling, because I could recognize that the environment itself was really absurd at that moment. That's something that can come through with that. So we have Tova's.
I gotta say one more thing. My Pluto is right at the end of the second house, so I feel a little bit of, and especially thinking about my dad and stuff, I feel that same like I can feel every conversation in the room, and I actually it's distracting to me to be in a group. Like I'm thinking about working with Patricia Walsh and doing the deep memory process, where there are all these little groups around, and we're supposed to be doing this really deep work, but my little Gemini moon is out there, feeling every other group that's going on. And I wonder if that's, because in other house systems, my Pluto is actually in the third house. So, you know, I guess I have a little feeling of it or something, a little feel of it.
Yeah, I think that when people have a different, like Placidus or whole sign Pluto, they often will resonate with the qualities of those too. So here's Tova's chart. We have third house Pluto in Scorpio, south node in Scorpio in the fourth house, north node in Taurus in the 10th, and it's squared by Jupiter in Aquarius in the seventh house, which makes the south node in Scorpio the resolution node. So, you know, taking into account this kind of bottom line, you know, clever, agile, intellectually charged focus with Scorpio here, then, you know, bringing in the skip step piece with evolutionary astrology, we would ask, like, so if this desire third house Pluto, why has it been switching back and forth between 4th and 10th? And it's actually really interesting if we think about now, but what I forgot earlier came back to mind, was that Gemini does have to do with masks. And it's not the only archetype, so does the 10th house. That's like the public mask that people wear. And so then here's 4th house, private life. So, I mean, the symbolism of that could be pretty clear. Just from that, like, piece alone is like this, you know, building the public self and then having the private self, and, you know, still going back and forth between which one is, you know, the deepest authentic self, and even, you know, bridging them and integrating them into one. So Tova, what do you think, or do you have some questions about Pluto in the third house or about your chart with that in mind that you want to ask?
Well, I was thinking about how having Chiron, the moon, and Mars also in Gemini specifically, and with the sun kind of teetering around that same cusp, I was just kind of thinking of how much Gemini energy is actually in my system. But I thought one of the interesting things about it was the fact that I'm able, and I've been told this, that I could sometimes say things to people that if anyone else would say that to someone, it would come across as super rude and like, how can you say that out loud to someone? But for whatever reason, the way I say it, it actually is like, oh, I do that, or I should do that. Like, and how that's like been a quality that I had, and that's maybe is assisting me with the new intuitive work of like being able to call someone out on their stuff, but like in a nice way. So I wasn't sure if that's also the Pluto third, like where that fits in all of that. But I thought that was it's an observation I've been told from other people.
Pluto in the third house could be a skill about having difficult conversations, or like, you know, getting to the bottom of stuff in conversation. I think that the manipulation piece or whatever is like part of the disempowerment angle of that, but like having, you know, clear, deep conversations with other people that, you know, are emotionally intuitive would be a strength of Pluto in the third. And then your Mercury, even though, you know, we can, you know, relate it because it's the same archetype of third house, is conjunct your north node, it's conjunct Athena. So maybe there's, you know, strategy in this kind of like gentleness, Taurus, that comes across, and the 10th house, like natural authority aspect. You know, like anything that you say, if there's like a tone of authority about it, that's not like, you know, positive authority, I guess, it's easier for people to hear than if it's this like, well, I was thinking about this thing, and, you know, this kind of like insecure delivery that breeds like more insecurity, basically.
And I'm curious about Chiron being in Gemini and how that relates to like.
So Chiron in Gemini, a lot of people who have this have Uranus and Sag opposite it, which you also have. And this one's really cool because it makes the symbolic realm of Gemini. So things like tarot cards or symbols like the ones we're looking at right now, or even just reading the environment, like what animals appear, what insects appear, that symbolic layer of reality is in this relationship to Uranus and Sagittarius. So it'd be these downloads of meaning. And so people that have the Chiron Uranus opposition, they're often really natural readers, like of tarot or other like divination systems, because it's not just that they, you know, have this like logical mental catalog of what all the symbols mean, but it's that when they tune into the symbols, they actually invoke the kind of Uranus download higher mind realm. So it just comes to them. It's a really cool.
I love that you just said that, because just realizing that Uranus is the ruler of my skip step, it just kind of, that just triggered a whole thing for me. So that's, I really love that you just said that.
The connections, that's cool. I think Chiron and Gemini is also about like speaking and like, you know, if it's the wounds and it's about language, you know, sometimes people that have Chiron and Gemini, they're insecure about their ideas or sharing them, or there's some kind of wound around like not being heard or listened to. But usually, you know, or maybe even just the thought of like, oh, I don't know what I'm saying, like it doesn't mean anything. But often the words that people with Chiron and Gemini speak have this kind of like, oh, that's what I needed to hear. There's this magical, you know, otherworldly, Chiron bridges the gap between the planets that we can see and the transpersonal planets. So it's like making, you know, the word is your key, or it's your wand into the magic realm. So, you know, and I don't know, I still, sorry. I was just wondering with Chiron and Gemini, sometimes that could have something to do with like, you know, it's another signature related to Pluto in the third of like words that hurt. So like, it's the same, it's like that line of like words that either hurt or heal. Words that empower, words that are like cruel.
I feel like also just not when someone's not communicating specifically or not sharing, that sometimes can carry more weight than like being told something, like the absence of words, like the absence of communication is like, oh.
That touches on like information being power, with like Mercury contacts with Pluto or Pluto in the third house. You know, information is a source of power, and so are secrets. And you know, there's like the revealing of secrets, there's giving information, there's withholding information, and there's all these different power plays that come up with Pluto when it's interacting with Mercury or a Mercury ruled house. So that makes sense that that would be like something that is uncomfortable for you when there's information that's not being shared, or just not being like put up on the surface, if you can feel it too as an undercurrent. What do you think about ninth house and like Sagittarius, and how that's played a role in balancing or like bringing empowerment to your Pluto?
I mean, even in the last year of really starting to develop the intuition, and also just going my entire life having to really figure out what was truth to me through religion and conditioning and just belief systems, and really finally starting to realize like what I always thought was correct for me, like really is more correct for me, or just in general. So the more I've been embracing that, the more things have felt a lot more aligned. And also just even recently, just breaking down paradigms of thought patterns that I used to have, of whether it's just like not being good enough or not worthy, like just random, like sort of the narrative, I say, like I've been dropping narratives lately and realizing that it's like, why have I been telling myself that this whole time? That's not even correct. And realizing that it was just a narrative, like playing constantly, sort of like in the background. So that has definitely been shifting throughout this same kind of journey.
Cool. It's that quality of thoughts being given so much power. I mean, by everyone too, but if Pluto's in the third house, that's something like especially magical to work through, and to gain agency on, of like, you know, it's not like you can totally control the mind or control your thoughts, but they can be conditioned, and like you can drop toxic thinking and like focus on positive or like empowering thinking. I think positive thinking as a phrase is so weird because sometimes it's also just like, you know, used as like a control thing. So I mean it in like a good nature, like a positive intention way, but the positive thinking doesn't always mean that.
Well,
That makes it.
Also, it's pulling on experiences that prove the opposite effect. Whereas whether it would be like an old thought pattern that I couldn't take care of myself, like I couldn't do that. Like that was the narrative. I was never going to have enough. And then going back into my experience and finding all these scenarios where, well, you took care of yourself there and you've been taking care of yourself and you have been resourceful and look at all this that you created. And it was like, oh, okay, I'm going to use those experiences to create the new narrative, where it really was a matter of the perspective of like, which story am I looking at? Which kind of draws me. It's kind of been something that's come up as a theme recently of like how the past can change, because the past is really just your perception of an event. And so when you've healed the thing that was messed up, it kind of does change the past, because you actually realize that whole time you were playing this undertone of a narrative that like was just your perception. And when you realize that that perception was not really real, then essentially you changed your whole past. So that was kind of something that's come through a lot this week for people and myself.
That's beautiful. I was just thinking about the same thing a few nights ago, where I was like thinking about things I regretted from the past, and I was feeling really bad as I was feeling that. And then I remembered this idea that you can reimagine the past and it like changes the present. And I tried it out and I started just like telling a different story about those past events, and my whole nervous system felt so much better. I like felt happy. And I was falling asleep and I was just like out soon after that. But it was this like adjustment. But I was actually thinking about that. And this really illustrates your chart too, with like the resolution node being fourth house, which has a lot to do with the emotional stored memories, nostalgia. And Scorpio here could be the like free will and deep like awareness of how you're holding memories and what narratives the ruler Pluto is. And that you're moving away from this Taurus, like the scarcity, I don't have enough, the like lack, and just literally generating abundance with your emotional frequency, which is Scorpio.
Yeah, that's very much been this, I feel like this whole work right now has been breaking that down and then kind of sharing that with people that come through with their own kind of questions on that. So that's really cool.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on Tova's chart or questions for Tova?
I really feel like having that Scorpio Pluto is deepening your effect with this, your transformational capabilities, not just having Pluto in the third house, but having it be a Scorpionic Pluto, doubly intensifies that focus for you of transformation of a mental paradigm through your mental processes. I love it. It's beautiful. Look at Dr. Joe Dispenza. He is doing exactly what y'all were just talking about. And you can do it in countless different ways. It's the simplest thing, just like you described, Sabrina. It's beautiful.
I am curious with Mercury being up there. And I guess in general with I typically am not, I have like a public speaking fear of putting myself, I'm curious, where does that really, once I put myself out there, like once I was like on here, it's like, oh, okay, I'm fine. But it's that build up to getting there. Like you'd think, is that like a Leo thing or is that a Gemini thing? Because it's the speaking.
It could be, I mean, both. Since information and speaking is a source of power with Pluto third house, it could be like the fear of like, you know, like the insecurity of revealing information. And then 10th house is like, it was also striking me that with Mercury and Taurus in the 10th and having the third house Pluto, that there's probably like a very methodical and like there's this ability to say what's of value, Mercury and Taurus, versus just like, you know, saying a bunch of things or being like really kind of like this like high buzz like third house stuff. It's like filtering it. Linda is saying Jupiter skip step. Is that about the fear of public speaking?
Yeah, definitely. In past lives, she would have maybe not spoken the truth, or maybe she did speak the truth and was persecuted for it. So that fear is encapsulated in that Mercury in the 10th house. And to get over that fear is to decondition away from that and to have the courage to speak the truth.
Right. The courage to speak the truth. And I think even like the emotional like recalibration of like because part of the persecution karmas and the fear of persecution, if someone's carrying that in their emotional body, that story can be picked up by people around them. It's like if there's an inner sense of like, oh, you know, like this idea is wrong, you know, other people are like, oh, that idea that person is thinking is wrong. Like there's, you know, this psychic exchange happening between people all of the time. So in the 4th house, Scorpio, it could be like this transformation of emotional body, of ego, so that there's, you know, the ability to externalize 10th house from a place of a core that is like, I guess, more in like intentional in that scorpionic way versus like holding these attachments or fears that they've been worked through and become a source of empowerment, both for Tova and other people that she encourages and talks to and, you know, helps uplift their viewpoints and their abilities.
Exactly.
I think too that's reinforced like the same theme to support what you just said, Sabrina, with the moon conjunct Chiron. You know, the emotional wounding from speaking her truth or not the truth. I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely resonated with what you said earlier about just being able to come up with something to get myself out of a sticky situation. That really made me laugh. That is so. Oh.
Yeah, and it's not a bad skill to have. I think it's like one of those things with anywhere that we have strengths, whether we're just thinking about it abstractly or we're looking at the chart, strengths can be strengths, or they can be things that we use as like a crutch or something of, so, you know, not dealing with an issue because you can say something to get out of it, which would be the way that the shadow element of a Pluto placement would get reinforced. And then that could attract, you know, the cataclysms or upheavals to bring awareness to that aspect of self.
Okay, Sabrina, I think we've reached close to the end. So any final comments or questions or final thoughts?
Just thank you everyone for your participation and for your awesome ideas. I feel like I got more clarity around this archetype from all this collaboration, so thank you for that.
So thank you from all of us.
Beautiful work,
everybody. Thanks.
And
Thank you, Sabrina.
Sharing your chart.
Thanks,
Thank
Tova.
you.
Thank you so much.
thank you, yay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.